Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm sure all of you just come from the main preview room where you saw the videos that were shown on the issue of human trafficking, and we're here in this briefing today to really look into why that is so important. So I'm here with Tim Colehan, who's an assistant director in our member external relations team. Thanks for the time today, Tim. Tim's really been the driving force behind this program within IATA, and he's going to give you a short presentation, and then we'll happily take your questions. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to attend. I know the jet lag's probably kicking in badly, as it is for many of us, but really just like to give you a quick update on the work that IATA is doing to mobilise the global airline industry in the fight against human trafficking. And what I'd like to just do briefly is to highlight in three buckets the work that we're doing. Firstly, to provide you, just as a sort of aid memoir, the extent of the crime that we're dealing with and the activity that we're dealing with here, and why the airline industry actually has a natural interest and is a natural ally for law enforcement and governments to help them to try and tackle the problem. I also just like to highlight to you what we're doing as part of our Eyes Open campaign. This is a campaign which has got various elements to it. Awareness raising, the provision of materials and practical materials that can help airlines to get involved. And also, finally, to look at the work that we are doing with governments and with other stakeholders and the approach that we're taking. So, again, some fast facts about this crime of human trafficking. I won't go into the definitions. You can look at that on Google, and some of them are very complicated, but it's a transnational crime. About 60% of human trafficking is transnational or cross-border, international borders. The estimates that we have, nobody actually knows. Nobody can put a precise figure on this, but the figures that we have seen from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, put it at somewhere around about 25 million. And if that's the case, you probably heard, if you were up in the room, Alexandra mentioned that that's about the equivalent of the population of Australia. So it's quite a large number of people. And unfortunately, the majority of them are women and children. It's, according to the US State Department, it's the fastest growing of all criminal activities. It's a $150 billion industry, again, according to estimates. And while governments have done very good work over the years to criminalise this activity, unfortunately, the number of prosecutions that we see lag behind. Now, the question is, what's this got to do with aviation? Well, you heard from Alexandra this morning that he often refers to the airline industry as being the business of freedom. We connect 4 billion passengers every year on 20,000 city pairs. And of course, the beauty of the aviation industry is that speed, that efficiency, and which delivers so many social and economic benefits to countries and to individuals around the world. It can also be misused by traffickers, unfortunately. Now, what we've seen in the last few years is that governments and law enforcement have been looking to transportation, the transportation sector, to help in the fight against human trafficking. And the reason is that they recognise that airlines and other transportation companies come into contact with their customers, often for long periods of time. Long periods of time that if airline staff are trained in being able to spot the signs of human trafficking, they could be an additional set of eyes and ears, an additional set of boots on the ground, providing law enforcement with intelligence on suspicions of human trafficking situations. Now, this is not new to airlines. Airlines are involved already. We heard from UNODC that Aeromexico is one airline that's got involved this year. The International Airlines Group, Emirates, Malaysia Airlines, these are all airlines that have launched big anti-trafficking initiatives themselves this year. And they're often part of sustainability and corporate social responsibility programs. But there's been no industry-wide activity or initiative until now. In the last 12 months, since the last AGM, we've been working away feverishly through our governance structure to make sure that we get their approval for a public-facing campaign, which we've called Eyes Open. So what we're doing is effectively mobilising our members. Now, just quickly, some reasons why airlines have that natural interest in tackling this issue. The first one is, I don't think needs any explanation. We need to do the right thing, and we will do the right thing. The second one is slightly more interesting, because there is a growing evidence now from various groups and various agencies of a clear link between human trafficking and the funds developed from human trafficking and international terrorism. And there's a report in the UK by the Henry Jackson Society that put the figure of between $10 and $30 million has been the amount that ISIS got in 2016 and generated from human trafficking. And those proceeds are then directed at terrorism, which is itself directed at international civil aviation in the form of unlawful interference, and tourism as well. So we've seen terrible attacks in Tunisia, etc., over the last few years. Airlines are also facing increasing regulatory activity in this space, and I've sort of broken that down into two elements. The first is what I would classify as general regulation. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, and we also deal with industry-specific regulation. In the general regulation, we're seeing a increasing trend towards the implementation of transparency in supply chain legislation. In the UK, we have something called the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. Australia is about to implement a very similar scheme, and Hong Kong is looking at, again, at a similar scheme. And what this requires is that airlines, along with other businesses of a certain size, have to provide annually a statement signed by one of their board directors, which underlines the work that they're doing and the initiatives that they're undertaking on ensuring that their operations and those of their suppliers are human trafficking free and modern slavery free. ICAO, when we look at the industry-specific regulations, we have in the US, we already have Congress mandating that airlines provide trafficking training, awareness training and reporting training to cabin crew, both on initial and recurrent. ICAO recently, in the last month, have published some guidance in the form of a circular, and that guidance and that circular call on states to mandate, again, training for cabin crew. So whether it's having to comply with national legislation, transparency and supply chain legislation, or indeed industry-specific regulations, those airlines that are already involved, already mobilised, got a head start in that area and well positioned. And then finally, reputational threats is very important. We've got to remember that increasingly now investors are demanding that the companies that they invest in are seen to be good corporate citizens, likewise with consumers. So what we're effectively saying is that work on human trafficking initiatives is actually good business practice. So what are we doing about this in a substantive way? The first thing is that for us, we often hear immediately the need for airlines to train. And that is critical and it's important, but on its own, it will not be enough. It will be just a simple tick box exercise if we're not careful. So our approach is quite to have a holistic or a comprehensive strategy, and that's what we have with our Eyes Open campaign. First of all, the first thing that we need to do is to make sure that airlines are aware of this issue, the extent of this issue, and the way in which traffickers abuse the services that we provide to further their criminal activities. We also need airlines to understand what to do. So once they're aware, what do we actually do now? What policies and procedures should we implement? How can we get hold of training materials? that will allow us to get involved in the fight against human trafficking. And so we're active in that space as well. And then finally, one of the things that is often missed is looking at the protocols. Okay, once we train our staff in human trafficking awareness, and if they identify suspicious incidents and they report them in accordance with the airline policy, to whom and to where do they report those incidents? And that's often forgotten, so that's a key part of the work that we're doing. And then finally, work on partnerships with government and wider stakeholders. It can't just be an airline-only approach. In terms of our Eyes Open campaign, we've been very active. We've developed an animated film, which you can see on the IATA.org website. We're developing infographics and posters and leaflets and other elements there. Obviously, events like today, media. We're also very active in terms of events, and we've been bringing together stakeholders. For example, in the UK, we held a workshop on aviation and hospitality's response to combating modern slavery and human trafficking. And that led to some actions to take forward that have been agreed in the UK, bringing together law enforcement, government, prosecutors, airlines and others who have a stake in tackling this issue. See the Swiss Army knife here, and so that depicts practical tools that we've developed. As I said earlier, once airlines are aware, they need to know what to do next. We've developed some extensive guidance materials, which again are available on our website. I'll share that with you at the end. That's been developed in accordance with law enforcement, with some NGOs, and our airline experts within some of our governance groups. And that sort of sets out a flowchart, as it would be, of how airlines should go about setting policies and procedures in their organisations. Very shortly, you will see some e-learning modules coming out that airlines can download and effectively plug and play, so that they can adapt those into their training for cabin crew and for other customer-facing groups. And we're providing more enhanced versions of that and in-company and classroom courses as well that we're supporting our airline members with. Now again, just coming back to this point about understanding the reporting protocols. So once trained, staff need to be encouraged to report suspicions of trafficking, and they need, as I said, to understand who to report them and to and why. So one of the things or as an example, in the air, a flight is inbound to a country, an identification of suspected trafficking has taken place on board the aircraft. The crew have monitored the situation, they've informed the pilot in command of the fact that they've got concerns, and that's going to be reported by the pilot to the ground in due course. But who on the ground? That's the question. So, do the operations department of the airline contact local law enforcement at the airport? Is there a national hotline number that they need to call? So what we're doing to try and help our members to ensure the effectiveness of this reporting is reach out to law enforcement and government agencies in multiple countries, over 90 countries that we're working on at the minute, to try and find out what they are. So we'll provide that list to our member airlines and keep it updated. Now, bringing all this work together under the Eyes Open theme, tomorrow we'll be presenting, as you heard Alexandre say in both his State of the Industry address this morning and again this afternoon, in the form of a resolution. And the resolution effectively sets out 4 key actions for the airline industry. First of all, it simply denounces this illegal, this crime. It proposes and encourages members to train their staff in how to identify and report human trafficking. It calls on governments to put in place those important reporting protocols that I was talking about earlier, and it identifies that IATA must work with other stakeholders, whether they be ground handlers, whether they be air traffic control organisations, and work collaboratively so that we get a comprehensive approach to trying to tackle this issue. And the important thing there, I think, is sharing best practice, sharing awareness campaigns. So, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of summary, we understand at IATA, and our members understand, that we can play a role. There's a role to play in helping to provide intelligence to law enforcement, and that is what we will do. But at the end of the day, we are not, our cabin crew and our staff are not quasi-law enforcement people. They're not trained law enforcement officers. They're providing tip-offs and intelligence gathering that law enforcement will then act upon in accordance with their own operational protocols as well. So it's really just saying and making it absolutely clear that it's the law enforcement authorities in each country that retain responsibility for dealing with human trafficking and prosecutions. As I say, we are ready to play a role, and we're mobilising our members, and we're committed to working with all stakeholders, whether they be governments, whether they be ICAO, or law enforcement agencies, to try and help tackle this at the industry level. As I said, I alluded to the fact that there are resources available that you can download on IATA.org/human-trafficking, so do take a look at that. And with that, Chris, I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so as Tim mentioned, this is going to be back on the floor of the AGM tomorrow, but this is your opportunity to ask questions of Tim now, if anyone would like to kick us off. Yes, please.
Glenda Quack from Agence France Press. You talked generally about the size of the issue of human trafficking around the world. Can you specifically, if you have any figures, talk about exactly how much of it you think goes through the aviation industry and why you're acting right now?
Okay. To answer the first point, nobody knows the extent of the issue in terms of how many passengers that are, or how many persons that are trafficked on board aircraft. So we've got no breakdown. It's very, very difficult to identify that. And to be clear, I don't think we will ever be in a position to tell you that as a result of the work that we're doing, X people are victims who become survivors of human trafficking. The second part of your question, why now? I think, as I said and I alluded to, over the last few years we've been approached by governments and law enforcement. At the last year's AGM, the keynote was given by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and it was the UN Office on Drugs and Crime that urged us to get involved, provided us with statistics on the extent, and highlighted really to the senior executive level management of airlines the role that we could play. And as a result of that, we've taken that challenge that they gave us and worked, as Alexandra said, through our governance process to make sure that we come up with sensible solutions to try and play a part.
Can I just follow up there?
Yeah.
Did they give you examples? You talk about training staff. So what kind of training, what are they looking for? Is there a generic or general kind of example that represents how airlines are being used, I guess?
Okay, there's no generic examples. We can provide you, and within the guidance there are numerous sort of examples of behaviours that could lead to suspicions, but not behaviours that on their own in isolation mean that somebody is being trafficked. So let me stress that. So I refer you to the guidance material for that. But what I would say is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. We have to be extremely careful in terms of training our staff. The training has to be good quality and comprehensive. That it puts together the awareness training of the signs, spotting the signs of human trafficking with their customer service experience, so that we try and minimise and reduce to the lowest extent possible, misidentification of people. That's the last thing that we want. But people are human at the end of the day, and mistakes will be made. But we think that the alternative of a trafficking situation happening is worth that, effectively.
It's also worth bearing in mind that we produced a short video which simplifies some of the scenarios in which different elements of the aviation value chain get involved in this but it's worth a look. It's on that website page. And you can see that sort of depicts 2 or 3 scenarios that are not untypical, but where staff may be able to see and intervene, not intervene is the wrong word, but make a note and then pass that on. Okay, let's have another question. Stefan?
Yes, you mentioned, my name is Stefan Schuble from Switzerland, Basel. You mentioned about, in slide 4, I guess, you mentioned that ICAO is making some rules or regulations, or
Yeah.
I didn't get that one.
Okay, so ICAO have produced something called Circular 352, which is a document, it's guidance for states on the training of staff in terms of human trafficking. I can provide you with a copy of that document. But within that, what they are calling for is for states, Switzerland, other states, to mandate training of a cabin crew in human trafficking awareness. Now, as I said, that's a critical element of our own campaign, that we're promoting airlines undertake that work. But our campaign is also focused around a more holistic approach of making sure that everything is in place before we start asking staff to report. The airline needs to have a policy in place. We need to get executive management support for that policy. We need to have the protocols for reporting so that law enforcement are aware. Are they going to see an increase in the rise of reported cases from airline staff in that jurisdiction? And also to mobilise other stakeholders in the country, whether that's Switzerland or anywhere else, so that we make sure that this is not just an airline approach. If we're going to have a holistic approach that delivers on our objectives, then it has to be all stakeholders in the value chain playing their part as well.
Thank you, Stefan.